Welcome, everybody, to Bible Bites. I'm Pastor Dan. We are reading through the Bible a small bite at a time. We are in Matthew 16, going to pick up here in verse 5. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Be careful, Jesus said to them, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So Matthew is the author of this book is just noting, okay, hey, in this instance, the disciples forgot to take bread, which was a main staple food. How you'd forget that, don't know, but they did. And so Jesus, just randomly, well, it probably wasn't so random in the midst of conversation or whatever. He says to them, hey, I want you to be careful of and guard yourself against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And in verse 7 it says, they discussed this among themselves and said, it is because we didn't bring any bread. So they're thinking Jesus is talking about bread. And we know that yeast is used in making bread. It's what makes bread rise. And this is, of course, why Matthew puts this first sentence in here. It makes more sense to us why the disciples would be discussing about forgetting to bring bread. That's because Matthew tells us, well, they actually did. They forgot to bring bread. So now Jesus, aware of their discussion, asks, he says, you have little faith. That's not a question. That's a comment, right? Why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? And here's why he says to them, you have little faith, okay? He says, don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered up afterwards? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread, like physical bread, but be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees? So Jesus basically saying, listen, it makes no sense whatsoever that I would be concerned about you forgetting bread, because don't you remember that I took just a couple pieces of bread and some fish, and I multiplied them to feed thousands. So physical bread isn't a concern to me. So why do you think I'm talking at all or concerned about bread? Physical bread. That's literally kind of what Jesus is saying. And so it says that then they understood. Okay, now they get it. He wasn't telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, an actual making of bread, but rather against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. All right. So it's not that everything that the Pharisees and Sadducees taught was wrong. Some of what they taught certainly was wrong. Much of what they did was actually wrong. Perhaps more of what they did was wrong than what they taught. But the fact is, they were not teaching the same things as Jesus. They were not pointing people so much to the Father and to the Messiah, but they were actually making it harder for people to come to God. They would put stumbling blocks in the way. They used the law almost as a weapon to beat people down, to make them feel not good enough, and so forth. And so Jesus was telling the disciples, beware. And of course, it was the religious leaders ultimately that stirred up the mobs, stirred up the crowds to crucify Jesus. And the Jews would stir up crowds and trouble for the apostles too later. And many of them would also meet their death because of the Pharisees' words and actions. So this is what Jesus is saying to them, beware of the yeast, beware of that stuff, that teaching which infects and gets into the mix of everything. That's yeast. All right, we will see you next time. Till then, be blessed.